Good morning to you in North America, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Africa and Europe. Welcome to today's event on the insurgency and policy responses in Mozambique, hosted by the Brookings Institution's Africa Security Initiative and the Initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors. I am Dr. Wonderful Bob Brown, Senior Fellow at Brookings, and the director of the Initiative of Nonstate Armed Actors and co-director of our Africa Security Initiative. The Biden administration has repeatedly emphasized how the threat of terrorism has spread beyond Afghanistan and the Middle East. And indeed, Africa has been a key locale of militancy and terrorism activity, as the Biden administration has repeatedly highlighted. Indeed, the emergence of militancy and its complex interactions with domestic causes and international terrorism has been dramatically playing out in Mozambique for several years and acutely this year and over the past several months. As the al-Shabab insurgency, a separate entity from al-Shabab in Somalia, gathered steam and took over communities and territories in the area of Cabo Delgado, but also with connections beyond that space. And indeed, in March, al-Shabab in Mozambique was one of the groups that the Biden administration designated as a terrorist actor. The government of Mozambique has, for several years, and including this year, struggled to respond effectively to the militancy, and ultimately has had to rely on international counterinsurgency, counterterrorism backup and support from a variety of African and other international actors. And in recent weeks, we have perhaps been seeing some improvements, but we are certainly far from the resolution of the complex situation. I am delighted today to be moderating a conversation with a terrific set of panelists to elucidate the dynamics going on in the country and to explore with us the policy responses underway and ways to improve them and strengthen them. Professor Adriano Alfredo Nuvunga, one of our panelists, is the director of the Centro para Democracia e Desenvolvimento, a democracy, governance, and human rights organization in Mozambique. Professor Nuvunga teaches political science and governance at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration in the Eduardo Mondale University in Maputo, Mozambique. He is also a senior research fellow at Good Governance Africa, an organization based in Johannesburg. And in addition to that, he chairs the Mozambique Network of Human Rights Defenders, as well as serves as deputy chairman of Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network. And he is in the process of writing a book that explores the nexus of weak governance, violent conflict, and the resource boom in Mozambique that has been implicated in the challenges and insurgencies in the country. I'm equally thrilled to be introducing Mr. Dino Matani, who is the Deputy Director of the Africa Program in the International Crisis Group. Mr. Matani started his career as a journalist for Reuters, covering the Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria, and later on as the West Africa correspondent for the Financial Times. After his distinguished journalistic career, he was appointed to the UN Security Council sanctions monitoring panels on the DRC and Somalia. And prior to joining the crisis group, he served as the senior political advisor in the UN peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And finally, I am also enormously pleased that we are joined by Ms. Zenaida Machado, who is a senior researcher in the Africa division of Human Rights Watch, where she covers Angola and Mozambique. She has conducted research and documented human rights abuses in both countries, covering a wide set of issues and a wide set of actors, and violations related to terrorism, as well as counterinsurgency operations, justice, and civil and political rights. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch in 2015, Ms. Machado worked as a journalist for BBC World Service, where she produced the flagship radio and television programs Focus on Africa and Network Africa. She has 2 decades of experience as a multimedia journalist, researcher, political analyst, and she also sits on the board of Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Professor Nuvungo, let me start with you. I would like to ask you to give us a brief overview of how the conflict has come about and where are we today, particularly after the Rwanda intervention this summer.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are at the moment. I think Cabo Delgado today is a militarily stabilized province. The violent extremism has been controlled. We cannot say it has been repealed. There is no evidence that it has been repealed, but it is militarily stable. After the intervention of both the Rwanda Defense Force and SADC, we have seen here and there actions of violence by the violent extremist organization. But one can clearly say that the violent extremist organization is in the run away, not yet clear as to what is happening, whether the members of the violent extremist organization, they are mingling with local communities, or they are running away to other parts of Africa. There have been, however, indications that the leadership of the violent extremist organizations, they have fled even before the Rwanda's Defense Force and SADC intervened in northern Cabo Delgado. So if we compare to where we were before, one can clearly say that it is stable, militarily stable. We see a more professional engagement by the Rwanda's Defense Force and the SADC in relation to communities, but the relative stability is based on the presence of the Rwanda's Defense Force, who have, together with the Mozambique forces, been able to give the necessary stability. As to the Mozambican Defense Force, it is not yet clear whether if the Rwanda's Defense Force and the SADC were not there, they would be capable. The reality, it shows that that capacity is not yet there, and it will take years to come until Mozambique can, with its own forces, provide that stability. So in a more general picture, what it's emerged in northern Cabo Delgado is that today it is more an issue of law and order and capacity, not only of the army, but also of the police to ensure law and order, particularly in relation to the aspects of organized crime and criminality and looting, which is taking place, also perpetrated by some sectors of the Mozambique defense forces. And while at the beginning, Mozambique, in terms of response, it has resorted to mercenary groups starting from the from the Russian mercenaries, and then to South African mercenaries. They have been not capable of controlling the situation. The intervention now, it seems to be effective. But again, while it is effective in terms of controlling, keeping the violent extremists at bay, there is issue now is the extent to which the key grievances that have led to where we are today, they are being addressed in two aspects here. One is whether the government will move towards dialogue as the way to engage not only elements of the violent extremist organization, but an inclusive dialogue which would bring all key stakeholders from different spheres, the Maputo-based elites and the local elites, etc., into a framework where grievances they can be addressed. I'm not saying that that has started the situation where we are today, but it has created an enabling environment for the violent extremist organization to start its activities and to thrive to the point of being there for almost 4.5 years without being addressed. And also the issue of how the IDPs and how the development is going to take place. How inclusive is that going to be as a way of bringing everyone to participate, but also and importantly to address those key grievances that have contributed significantly, as I've indicated, to where we are today. Everyone is expecting for the private sector to resume activities. We have seen it in the past, in the beginning of the year, in March, where the international oil company Total rushed to resume the activities, and then we had the attack to Palma, and all went back to where it was. So, looking at zooming into what is happening today, it would be perhaps opportune to use the stability, not to rush to resume activities, but to address some of the fundamental root causes that have brought us to where we are today. But as I've started by saying, Cabo Delgado is stable comparing to where we were in the past 4 years. We have to say that the international deployment has contributed significantly into bringing Cabo Delgado into a situation of military stability.
Thank you very much. This is a great overview of where we are today. And you started talking about the root causes, which is a great transition to the question that I would like to pose to Mr. Matani, to give us more of a background of how we got in Mozambique to the state where we are today, and more importantly, perhaps where we were in the spring and summer, where the situation seemed quite dire and really spinning out of control very rapidly. Dino, what are the details of the root causes in the country, and also what are the international dimensions of the conflict?
Thanks. Yeah, so I will take the audience through 3 sort of contributing factors to the evolution of this conflict. One, I suppose, is the evolution itself of grievances that came out of the post-liberation era in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. Secondly, the recent resource boom and the feelings of grievances that had already been whipped up by that stage, then feeding into or being fed by the boom in natural resources, particularly gas and mining. And thirdly, there's as you say, there's an international dimension to this in 2 senses. One, the return from the 90s and the growing sort of escalation of Salafist ideologies that were brought back into Mozambique as students who were sent out to across the Arab world to be schooled in Islam, returned back to Mozambique in the 90s, and then fed the environment with forms of Salafism that were then picked up and then misused by frustrated bands of youth. The second dimension to that international dimension is the overall dynamic that we see in the Swahili coast, which is a sort of from the 90s and stemming from the networks that were evolving at the time and connected to Al-Qaeda East Africa, and radical clerics such as Abu Drogo, the Kenyan cleric who was killed in 2012. There was a spreading throughout the region, enmeshing itself also in al-Shabab Somalia, which is an Al-Qaeda franchise, and not to be confused with what is known in Mozambique also locally as al-Shabab. But those networks over the last 20 years have spawned also a regional network of young men who've been involved in various terrorist attacks in Kenya, in Uganda, in East Africa generally, in Somalia, of course, and a big proportion or a significant proportion of the Mozambican insurgency turns out to be Tanzanians and even a smaller number of Kenyans who became the sort of foreign component of that. So just to go through all of these sort of one by one, I mean, Cabo Delgado itself was the birthplace of Mozambican liberation. And so after the Liberation War, this province, which also then happened to be 2,000 kilometers away from the capital, became the preserve of various elites who monopolized and captured both the political and business spaces in Cabo Delgado, in this far away, distant province, and in the post-liberation environment. We saw the development of a political economy in Cabo Delgado that was something of a Wild West that became also the repository for massive amounts of heroin trafficking coming through and controlled by powerful elites in that region. And it became an economy that was exploited by those who were privileged enough to have the power to do so, or who were also co-opted and permitted to exploit that economy. And over time, that has also sort of fed in to some of the socio-economic and asymmetries that have developed in Cabo Delgado. A lot of people point to poverty, but of course, the human development indicators are sometimes even worse in neighboring provinces than Cabo Delgado itself. So poverty on its own is a simplistic explanatory factor to this, but rather it's the sort of inequity of the political economy and the political system that drove many youth, particularly from the coastal Mwani communities and also the ethnic Makwa, from the interior of Mozambique, against those who are predominantly Muslim, against those who they associated with the power in Maputo. And of course, by that I mean the Makonde tribe of President Nyusi, which is the a major ethnic community in Cabo Delgado itself. That's not to paint this as an ethnic conflict. We should not do that, and it's not. It's definitely not a factor in driving people to conflict, but it is definitely an explainer of, or you can see the trends of the recruitment from the Mwani and Makwa in particular into this insurgency. So you had this sort of asymmetry that characterized the political economy of Cabo Delgado, and to some extent, it's also worth noting that a large proportion of the Mwani are also Renamo supporters. So there is that also sort of quasi-political dimension to this. Then you had the resource boom and the development of, or the finding of massive gas reserves that are, of course, very well known about and that have attracted billions of dollars of investment, and also the development of ruby mines, which attracted also a number of artisanal miners and foreigners who, after 2017, were expelled from those mines in the west of the province, from Montepuez district, which actually is not one of the districts that is associated with this particular conflict, but out of those mines poured expelled miners, some of whom, during the course of our research, which made it into a report in June, published by Crisis Group on the insurrection. A number of the boys who were expelled from those mines ended up in the insurrection itself. These were young men who were selling perhaps some of their rubies into the trading networks, Mocimboa de Praia town, which is one of the key constituencies of the Mwani community. And then the third dimension, which is the Swahili coast dimension. Around the time of the start of this insurrection in 2017, in parallel to what we associate as the first shot, the time where the first shots were fired in Cabo Delgado, you also had the escalation of crackdowns, particularly security crackdowns, particularly in Tanzania, culminating also in that year, where the security forces went after various jihadi networks in Tanzania who had long associations with the al-Qaeda East Africa networks and those connected also to al-Shabab Somalia. And at that time, we understand that many of those who fled those crackdowns also then fled into Tanzania, into Mozambique, but also, as it happens, an escalating a number of them that also moved into the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they also found new possibilities to join new conflicts in North Kivu province with the Allied Democratic Forces, which happens to also be an armed group allied to Islamic State right now. And therein, perhaps we'll come back to this in the question and answers or in the next phase of the discussion, but that also will, will now play an important role in explaining or explaining the threat level, the emerging threat level, the rising threat level that is now being delivered by the transnational network, which is waiting to see how these military operations unfold. So in a nutshell, those to us are have been the key driving forces. I'll leave it there and hand back the floor.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We will definitely come back to the transnational networks threat landscapes, particularly as the United States is finding its way of how to reposition its counterterrorism responses abroad and certainly in Africa during the Biden administration. Zenaida, Dino spoke about the international dimensions, the repercussions of crackdowns, and Adriano spoke, as well as Dino, about the socioeconomic inequities. Let me ask you about the human rights dimensions of the conflict on both sides, and please give us a flavor, really, of what life has been like for communities as the violence had been escalating for several years, and particularly this year.
Thank you so much, Wanda, for this opportunity. Thank you for Dino and Adriano for these wonderful presentations prior to mine. What I can say is that the human rights situation in Mozambique and in Cabo Delgado in particular has deteriorated even further this year. And this is despite the military gains that Adriano talked about, which are the result of the intervention of international forces, including those from Rwanda and from the Southern Africa Development Community, also known as SADC. As of September this year, the Mozambican government and United Nations refugee agents were estimating that over 800,000 people were displaced. Of those, 84% lived in temporary accommodation provided by host communities across the country. Only 9% of them were in government camps across Cabo Delgado, Niassa, and Nampula provinces. In July, the UN World Food Programme warned that northern Mozambique could face in the coming years and months a hunger crisis because most of the families that have been displaced have not had access to their camps to cultivate for the next agricultural season. And because those that are in the area continue to be scared of the violence and some are still fleeing. As in the last year, this year again, humanitarian groups have been unable to reach those in need, especially in areas that are isolated in Palma, Macomia, Mocimboa da Praia, and Midumbi and Kisanga districts. It was only in September this year that the WFP and some other few groups managed to resume the supply of food to Palma. This after 6 months of hiatus. Displaced people continue to report lack of conditions in the camps that were set up by the government, including lack of privacy, food, medical care, and trauma care, especially for women who have witnessed horrendous abuses, including beheadings of their relatives, kidnapping of their children, sexual abuse. There are also allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse of women in exchange of humanitarian aid. Mozambican security forces have been implicated in allegations of human rights violations during the counterterrorism operations, including intimidation, ill treatment of displaced people, use of excessive force against unarmed civilians, and extortion. We have documented cases where displaced people accused government force deployed to Palma in March of forcing distressed residents to pay bribes in exchange for a seat on the rescue planes. As of now, the government of Mozambique has not taken any publicly known step to investigate those abuses or punish those implicated. It is also concerning to us that despite the intervention of the military forces from SADC and Rwanda, which are widely considered more disciplined and prepared for this type of counterterrorism operations, the narrative continues to be about how many insurgents have been killed, rather than how many have been captured, arrested, formally charged, and waiting for a trial. We as Human Rights Watch have also documented serious abuses by the armed group known as Halusana Wajama, or locally called Mashababus or al-Shabab, including war crimes. Among those, killings of civilians, in many cases beheadings, kidnapping of women and children, destruction of property, including schools and hospitals. We also found evidence that the al-Shabab fighters are using hundreds of kidnapped women and girls in forced marriage and sex slavery. Some of the women were also released after their families paid a huge sum of money in ransom. The group is also implicated, and we have published on that, in kidnapping of boys and subsequently using them to fight the government, which is a violation of the international prohibition of use of child soldiers. I noted at the beginning that there have been various military gains, and Adriano also mentioned them, made the government forces with the international partners. We continue to advocate that both the United States and European training missions that the US one is already in Mozambique, the European one is arriving now in December, should include the component of human rights, justice and accountability. Hopefully, by doing so in the near future, we will have a Mozambican force better prepared to assist, protect civilians while respecting the rights of detainees and the suspected militants during the counterterrorism operations. It is disappointing, however, to see that the humanitarian and social part of this conflict has not progressed at the same level of the military one. Until last week, for example, discussions about the operationalization of the SADC disaster preparedness and response mechanism were still ongoing. This center was launched in July at the same time that the military side was launched. But it will only be fully established only after 2/3 of the state members of SADC have endorsed it or signed the MOU. And that's problematic because as we approach the rain season, the risk we have against displaced people, civilians, becomes even bigger. We know that the rain might considerably limit the army soldiers' movements on the ground and in their efforts to restore security, especially in Nangat, Makumia, Musimba, da Praia, and Palma. Depending on the intensity of the rain, as we have seen in the past, we could see destruction of road access to areas of conflict or areas where a lot of people, displaced people run to, which could make it harder for humanitarian aid to reach people in need. And last but not least, rain season in Mozambique in particularly often comes with its own disaster management challenges. And our fear is that this could steal the attention and the few resources that have been allocated to the current humanitarian crisis that has been caused by this 4-year-long conflict. So I will stop now, Wanda, and maybe engage later when the questions start coming in.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Machado, for bringing those dimensions. I want to highlight just one data point that you mentioned. 800,000 displaced, 84% without being in government camps. 800,000 displaced in a country like Mozambique is a serious challenge, and the international community is preoccupied with humanitarian crises elsewhere in Africa, in places like Ethiopia, obviously in the Tigray region, elsewhere in the world like Afghanistan. But the suffering and the challenges in Mozambique, just in terms of the humanitarian dimension, remain very significant. Professor Nuvungu, let me return to you and then also Mr. Matani and Ms. Machado and explore with you more the policy responses. Let me start with you by asking about managing the resources in a way that will allow for greater equity, what is in popular parlance called addressing the root causes. You started exploring that. Mr. Matani spoke in great detail about the exploitation frenzy in Cabo, its inequality, the capture by elite. What can and should be done now to start redressing those issues? And is there, in fact, any recognition on the part of the government of Mozambique and the elite in Mozambique, as well as the multinational companies that operate there, that resolving the underlying socioeconomic inequity, the inability to participate in the riches that resources have brought there, have contributed to the militancy?
Thank you very much. Indeed, that is the biggest issue at the moment in Cabo Delgado, in the sense that if we look at the root causes of this conflict, It speaks to an elite-centric extractivism of natural resources, elite-centric extractivism, which is not developmental, and it has denied development to local communities, and it has disenfranchised the young people. And that is overall a violation of human rights, because development, it's a right on its own. So if you are asking what can be done, I think a lot of actors here have a lot to do, including the international private sector. From government side, there is a need to change a policy from an elite-centric extractivism to a more developmental-oriented extractivism. And by extractivism, I'm not only talking about oil and gas. I'm talking about minerals, alluvial minerals, ruby and other minerals. Cabo Delgado is one of the richest provinces of this country, but is one of the most neglected, marginalized, and unequal. And that state of affairs, it has allowed elites to distribute among themselves the wealth of that province. What is next to us that we can realistically do as part of addressing the conflict in the next months? And that's where perhaps you have more the possibility of a public and private sector dialogue is around the local content. Local content. If you asked Total today, how much money have they spent in local content? They would say they have spent around $1 billion in local content. Then you ask them, where is that money? They will say that money, it was captured by the Maputo-centric elites. Now look, Maputo is 2,010 minutes flight from Pemba, almost from Amsterdam to South Marrakesh. And the local elites, they haven't felt that they have benefited of a local content policy, which is not in fact in place. So we need international private sector to understand that the world has changed, in that it's no longer the extracting and go. It is about using resources, contribute for local development in a robust engagement with local stakeholders, local communities, and benefit from it. And that has not yet been the case. Even the local content that has benefited some of the Cabo Delgado centric, it hasn't been local. We need a local content policy that will enable Cabo Delgado centric elites to participate meaningfully in what is happening in the province, because we forget something important. Gas is different from oil. When you discover oil, you just pipe and send to market. Gas, it's a mid to long term and $1 billion investment. So people see and hear every day billions of dollars were invested from TV, etc. But in their plate, there is nothing to eat. So we need a shift at the policy level from the Maputo leadership to understand that when we announce billions, those have to reflect in the livelihoods of the people, of the young people, and allow local stakeholders to in an inclusive and transparently participate in those processes. And I think that here is where the Brookings can make an important contribution and bringing international private sector to also shift from extracting and go, but also engage leadership in Mozambique in order to move. What is said, though, is that I haven't seen much of that learning governance. No. If you look at what's happening, 4.5 years after the start of the violent extremists, you don't see, I haven't seen up until now, a policy change resulting of absorbing the lessons from what happened and the root causes and addressing them at a policy level. That we haven't seen. And that needs to be changed, needs to be addressed if we were to start a new path of an inclusive local development, addressing human rights and allowing business to prosper and international and the domestic private sector to make what they know best, which is business.
Thank you very much. Very important urging, and something that we all need to be paying attention to, something that has also been frequently a challenge in conflict, where even when militancy is suppressed, getting to more equitable redistribution of resources, getting to development in communities that have been marginalized, even as they sit on top of significant resources, has been a major challenge in many conflicts around the world, in Africa, but also in places like Colombia and Myanmar, and hence conflict festers and morphs in different ways. Dino, at the beginning, Adriano told us that the intervention of SADC and Rwanda Defense Forces have produced a stabilization of the militancy, that the militancy is now controlled. That is certainly important. I wonder and would like to reflect with you how that how lasting and how much one can build on this improvement. You worked in Nigeria, I've worked in Nigeria, you've covered other regions of Africa for the International Crisis Group. And we have seen in many conflicts in Somalia, in Nigeria, that the external intervener scores important successes. Perhaps the government mobilizes and scores important successes. There seemed to be progress in the so-called clearing phase of militancy. The holding becomes a real struggle, and the building part never materializes, and conflicts becomes entrenched, morphs, re-escalates, like has been happening in Somalia, like has been happening in Nigeria. Please tell us, what do you think needs to happen now with the military intervention, where we are, and are we really in a situation where the external intervener, Rwanda, will end up being stuck in Mozambique, SADC as well, for a long time to come?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, there is a risk that this turns into, another intractable forever type of war. And I mean, let me just start by saying, and so also echoing what Dr. Nuvunga was saying, there's no question, absolutely no question that the military intervention has succeeded in disrupting the militant group, taking back important territory, stabilizing important parts of the province, including the Palma to Mocimboa de Praia axis, and giving the chance of tens of thousands of people to return to their homes. But it's almost like this is the easy part that's been done. Now, what happens next is going to be absolutely critical. There's still hundreds of thousands of people displaced. Look very carefully also at the public announcements of the authorities involved in this military campaign. There was an announcement the other day on another webinar by Rwandan officials that they've killed up to about 100 terrorists. That's a small dent in an armed group that at its height was possibly estimated somewhere along the lines of 4,000 people if you included all the porterage and other ancillary units that were perhaps not direct fighting units, but still a small amount that's really been claimed as being neutralized at this point. I'm actually going to give the military intervention more credit because actually, according to some of the defector accounts that we've heard, there has been probably a loss of about 1,000, possibly more, elements from the insurgency itself. So it's diminished in capacity, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that militants have simply scattered. They've melted back into the communities, or they've put their weapons underground and drifted also into IDP camps, into displacement camps, and then they're sitting and waiting now to see what will happen. And while the population is also not fully moving back to liberated or so-called liberated areas, conversations are going on in these camps, in these locations, between young men who, by night were militants, by day, or another comparison, who were once militants, but who are now sitting in IDP camps, which themselves can, if things go wrong, become recruitment pools for the next phase of the insurgency. And so what the expectation is of the people, but also of the civilians, but also young men who might otherwise be persuaded to hold on to their guns, everybody's waiting for the response now. What is going to be, besides the military response, what is going to be the response of the government? It is notable that there isn't, there's a military response, but there doesn't seem to be a demobilization, classic DDR response. Government has paid lip service to it. That there isn't such a thing as a defector program. There needs to be conversations to what degree amnesty can be used as a tool, and where do you set the threshold of that? Because certainly those who are involved in the worst egregious crimes need to be brought to justice as well. But without those kinds of conversation, you don't have the exit corridor that could certainly play a role in draining the swamp, if you like, use that terminology, around the militants. So, military operations are unlikely, and I've heard this from the Mozambican authorities themselves, going to be able to eradicate this problem, which is essentially a problem of the grassroots societal issues that have blown up in this perfect storm. And you can't just sort of shoot your way out of that problem. You have to fix the problem from whence it came. So military operations, but no demobilization or defector strategy that is emerged. Then you also have development and the mobilization of hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly more, by the World Bank and its partners as they're gearing up to support the government to now intervene via various programs and strategies that have been developed by the government to start inserting into liberated areas projects, money that can be used to deliver services, to also resettle families. But there's also a question there about whether that development initiative is really rooted in a political strategy. There is sort of discussion at the moment of some sort of government-backed reconciliation unit that I've started hearing about, which in theory could play a role in brokering the kinds of conversations, as we mentioned in our report, in the policy section of our June report, to broker the kinds of conversations that would need to happen on the ground between the state and the communities, who are essentially the pools of society from which militants have also been recruited from, to find an accommodation between, as regards how this money is spent, so that the development doesn't, and this is the mistake that has also been made in the Sahel, where you also have Islamic State franchises, continuing to expand and to inflict terrible abuses on the population. you put in development, but without a conversation about how that money is spent, you inflame the perception that this money is now being channeled into through patronage networks and into projects that don't necessarily directly benefit the people. Let's hope it doesn't get to that stage. I mean, there's still a lot of good work that's being done. I don't want to sound as if I'm saying that these development efforts aren't worthy. They very much are, and they're needed, but they need to be channeled in a way that and embedded within a political, social dialogue that needs to take place at the same time. If this does not happen, there are grave consequences, because we're not just talking about an armed group that is operating in a vacuum in Mozambique. It's part of a regional conflict system, which I'm going to describe now in a few minutes. And what seems to be happening is, well, the risk that is emerging is that if the root causes are not treated, if there isn't an honorable way out for fighters that gives them a chance to reintegrate back into society, and that process is not underwritten with development and social dialogue, such as I've described, and if they continue to feel as if their backs are pushed up against the wall, they will turn towards the extremists. And we know from the research that we've done that there was a significant component in the at the height of the insurgency 2020 to 2021 that came from abroad, the Tanzanians especially, but a smaller number of Kenyans. We also heard about Somalis and other nationalities from the Great Lakes. And I'm actually presently in the Great Lakes at the moment, looking at the very connections between Mozambique and conflicts on this side of the continent. And there are connections. There have been Mozambicans who've traveled to Eastern Congo to get training. That you would have read about a Jordanian suspect who was arrested in Congo traveling through Tanzania. On his way through Tanzania, he may have met some Mozambicans and given them some instructions. So there's a lot of crossover taking place. There are bomb plots that are being uncovered in Uganda and Rwanda that have connections both to Eastern Congo and possibly to Mozambique. The Kenyan authorities are also raising the terrorist alert right now. I've been based in Kenya for a long time, and I've never seen so many security alerts popping up of this nature, including of threats of improvised explosive devices that can be detonated here and there. And this knowledge, what we're starting to see is the development of a financial recruitment and IED proliferation network in East Africa, connected to these two theaters of conflict, Mozambique and Eastern Congo, that involve Kenyans and Tanzanians and other Swahili coast nationalities, who are spreading the knowledge of how to, set off bombs in public places. And if the solutions are not found in Mozambique, they will bide their time. They will wait for the military operations, the military response to go static, as it's starting to do, because you've had the kinetic phase where the insurgents have been pushed aside, some of them killed. Now they're going to regroup and come back using asymmetric tactics. And this is a playbook that we've seen time and time again in other theaters of conflict. And so to circle back to, I don't want to exaggerate also the globalist terrorist network. I think that's also a very unhealthy tendency to portray this all as Islamic State. It's not. We made it very clear that you have Mozambican muscle, the Mozambican boys who tend to be fighters of the al-Shabab, who are willing to put down their guns or walk away from conflicts if they don't get paid. Whereas you do also have the hardened jihadists, particularly from abroad, who are also, trying to exploit this conflict. And there needs to be solutions for both these problems. I think the best solution for Mozambique right now is to address those grievances. Defector program and dialogue accompanying development. Otherwise, you risk getting embedded in a forever war where the military partners of the Mozambican state will be facing what AMISOM has been facing in Somalia for the last 10 years.
Thank you, Dino. Again, an excellent transition to Ms. Machado. I am glad that you raised the issue of the defectors program, something that I in partnership with the United Nations University, have studied in great detail in Somalia, in Nigeria, in Iraq, in various parts of the world, and something that is important, but often very challenged. And a lot of lessons to be learned in what works, what doesn't, what are the limitations. But the overarching point that you are raising, Mr. Matani, about not overestimating the capacity of military solely responses to decimate an insurgency and accompanying it with a variety of other policies like the Defectors Program is really a fundamental one. And Ms. Machado, I would like to go here with you. I mean, what we have seen in many conflicts, counterterrorism responses around the world over the past 20 years, including in African contexts, is precisely very significant over-militarization only of the conflict, even as often the military struggle, in fact, is inadequate and problematic, but also very harsh legal responses and sort of very harsh attitude of no mercy, no reconciliation with the alleged terrorists and the support networks. This has been dramatically playing out in contexts like Nigeria in response to Boko Haram and Islamic State in West Africa. What are your thoughts about transitional justice issues, defectors programs, some sort of legal leniency, perhaps amnesty that Dino spoke about, other ways to both address human rights violations by all sides, but also provide some incentives to disengage from the battlefield, and any other elements of the policy response that you see as lacking?
Thank you so much, Vanda. I think when we talk about Mozambique, we shouldn't forget that it's a country with many challenges. Cabo Delgado is by far the first challenge the country is facing, and by far the first conflict. This is a country that in its own history has had already 4 amnesty deals following conflicts. 3 of them were post-election conflict. Next year there will be elections. The year after there will be elections, and we don't know what will happen after those elections. And we could probably count for 5 and then 6 amnesty deals. And then if we count Cabo Delgado as well, the way we are suggesting amnesty, that would be 7 and then 8 and then 10. And then we are slowly building a state of impunity, which has been our concern for some years now. The lack of justice and accountability for crimes and abuses that are committed. When we talk about the legal process in Mozambique, we have to start from where did we ever hear the government making a public pledge to investigate the crimes and abuses and then hold community meetings to consult the communities about what they want on their future, to hear from the civil society what are the best options for the country. Quite often what we have seen following conflicts is the 2 parts sitting down in a room privately and deciding on their fate and the fate of the entire Mozambican community. And most of the times that fate or that agreement that they reach only benefits the 2 of them. We can go back in history to the most recent conflict before Cabo Delgado, which was the one in Gorongosa, between the government and the opposition party that at the time still had a military wing that is now in the process of disarming. People had their houses destroyed. Many people were killed, and a known number of people were killed, and a known number of people were forcibly disappeared. I personally spoke to women who have not seen their husbands for years, and they don't know what to do with the husband's clothes in the house because they have not been informed of the state of the husbands. Have they died? Have they been arrested? Have they run away? And when we look at the solution the government and the opposition party have come up with for the specific case of Gorongosa was a peace deal, a disarmament process, and a reintegration of the Renamo armed men. We haven't heard about justice and accountability for the crimes that were committed. Instead, what we heard is that they are going to be given a blank amnesty. We also haven't heard about compensation to those people that were affected by the conflict. And my fear in Cabo Delgado is that when we start talking about amnesty, is we seem to forget that this conflict is more than just about the government and the militants. It's also about the people that were affected. A lot of people that have been displaced, of these 800,000 people displaced, they had their own land. I don't think I need to explain a lot about what it means to having your own 100 per 100 meter land and within 24 hours being forced to abandon all of that and to go live in a place, in a tent of just 1 meter, 2 meters by 2 meters, where you can barely go to the toilet without being seen by your next neighbor who is also staying in a tent. And most of them, or at least many of them, might not be able to recover their land again. Or they don't know what is their situation at the moment. So before we talk about amnesty for the members of the group or for the police or the soldiers or police officers that might have been involved in crime and abuses, we also need to talk about how to reconcile with the communities, how to make sure that these type of groups like the al-Shabab don't continue to grow and be able to recruit in the communities, because the communities don't trust the state. They are angry at the way they have been treated by security forces, and they are hopeless and therefore not able to even collaborate with security forces. So people need to be compensated. First, before even compensation, they need to feel that they're safe. They need to be given the basic resources to recover. I mentioned medical care. I think it's unacceptable that over 80% of the displaced people are not even receiving direct help from the government because they are staying with host communities or they're staying with friends. I have spoken to people in Pemba that are accommodating in their houses, over 50 people that they don't know. They've never heard of them before. They accommodated one relative who brought 10 people along. So they need to be given the conditions, basic conditions, food, water, medical care. Their children need to go back to school. They need to be provided with education. They need to be given land or provided with an opportunity to go back to where they're coming from to their land. And on top of that, they need to be compensated for what they lost. They need to see justice and accountability for the atrocities that they have witnessed. It's unacceptable that a country that respects or claims to respect the rule of law has had so many conflicts over its history, but very little accountability and justice for the crimes committed.
Well, thank you very much, Zenaida. Those are very important words, and I am reminded of the two extremes that the transitional, so-called transitional justice mechanism sometimes swing between, which is blanket amnesty you spoke about, often perpetuating many forms of unaccountability and problems. The so-called high-value defector program in Somalia immediately comes to mind. Or alternatively, just blanket rejections of any kind of leniency, sending every alleged member, even if membership meant simply paying zakat, to an execution squad, equally enormously problematic and at various times, or even today, still playing out again in places like Somalia or Nigeria. And I'm also really would like to reemphasize your very important point about the need for dialogue with communities about what kind of defectors programs, what kind of leniency what kind of alternative, imaginative accountability mechanisms can be built into so that brutalized communities have a sense of justice in the absence of simply death penalty or very lengthy imprisonment that creates for alleged members, that creates its own problems, and the need for community voices, community level work, as opposed to trying to impose such programs from afar. I am going to start taking questions from the audience. I have been already folding them into my conversations with our extraordinary panelists today. Please continue to submit questions. Let me start with you, Professor Novungu. Several of the questions that have come in, quite a few actually, raised the question that we started exploring in different ways, are asking about really what next? And asking about the chances that the insurgency, the militancy in Cabo Delgado will become decentralized. One of our audience member has written, the rebellion in Cabo Delgado is almost entirely vanquished at this point. Something we have been exploring. Is that in fact the case or not? Yet both in Mozambique's War of Independence and Civil War, a vanquished regional rebellion morphed into a decentralized, all-out, multi-regional insurgency. This was the case with Frelimo, again, in the war against the Portuguese. This was later the case with Renamo against the central government. What do we do to avoid that? We have spoken about some dimensions, but would you like to elaborate on that issue? Quite a few questions are asking about that next phase, how to avoid that entrenchment, fragmentation. And I would add to that, what are the chances that militancy, fragmented morph, perhaps would spread to other parts of Mozambique, such as southern communities in Mozambique?
Indeed, there are so many questions, but I think it's important to acknowledge that after 4.5 years, Cabo Delgado is militarily stable. It has been difficult to be there. And the government response, it has, on the one hand, fueled the violent extremists and the growth in terms of confidence and capacity of the violent extremist organization. I would like to mention here the use of the groups, like the Wagner groups, like the South African mercenary groups, that has been disastrous response. But now seems to be, wouldn't say okay, because we have RDF on the one hand, and we have SADC. From a civil society perspective, we would have wanted to have RDF coming under the ban of SADC, not having this parallel, because it might have led into stability now, but in the mid run, it's going to be problematic to handle this the way it is now. But back into your question as to what is next. What is next? It would be to set things right. Set things right. It means utilizing the existing governance architectures. Government has put in place ADIN, the Integrated Agents of Northern Development. Government should use that. At the beginning, we're critical about it because we thought it was corrupt, but there have been changes, and we commended those changes. So we think most of the response, it should go via ADIN as a way of allowing institutionalized channel of assistance to IDPs first, and then to move into issues inclusive development and overall a policy of an inclusive development sort of framework, which is not yet there. And we don't see it happening. What we see is that the IDPs are not properly being handled. We don't see proper channels where people would have opportunity to come out and say, I was victim of this and I want to come out, I want to participate. So allowing humanitarian spaces for victims to come out. But what we more and more hear is the killing of violent extremists, militarily killing, is the issue of dismantling of bases, etc. This is good, but from the humanitarian, international humanitarian law perspective, it would be important to see that happening. We don't see, and this it can in the short to mid run become a problem, and it would be important really to allow like ICRC to follow this. We don't see this happening the way that we would like to see it. But overall, as I've indicated, setting things right, it means putting in place a comprehensive dialogue mechanism, a comprehensive dialogue mechanism. At the moment, we are doing a number of initiatives, including the voluntary principle on security and human rights. On the other hand, on one hand, on the other hand, we are putting in place the a platform for dialogue, for conflict resolution. But that is civic driven, and government is participating in it. It has to be commended for that. But this, from a civil society perspective, it's creating enabling environment to start a comprehensive dialogue. But then it would need to be picked by those who have the powers and to convene important conversations, including those who, as from a political economy perspective, who are the losers, who are the winners, from local and national stakeholders, and who are the potential kind of spoilers, etc. And all this, it can be identified if government decided to move things right. And as I conclude, I would like to say that we have the feeling that with the consolidation of the military stability, government tends to move away from the initial openness of engagement and dialogue. More and more, we see a kind of a policing nature of the state emerging, which it will contribute to the very same root causes that brought us where we are today. And again, the international private sector has an important role to play. I would like to tell some of our participants here that in the very same way that we have the FCPA, which has been preventing corruption overseas, we can also find ways of embracing in the international private sector those mechanisms that would allow them to engage local governments across Africa and Mozambique in particular to understand the need of local development in an inclusive and participatory and transparent way. And this has systematically been failing in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. The risk,
Thank you.
The risk, of course, one last point, the risk, of course, of this expanding across the country, Mozambique has high level of fragility, has a high level of vulnerability. But In the form of violent extremism, we think that this is local to the northern Cabo Delgado region due to the elements that we have alluded to at the beginning, including alluvial mineral activity, etc.
Thank you very much. I am mindful of the time. We have 15 minutes left. And so I am going to ask a question from the audience to each Dino and Zenaida, and ask you please to limit your responses to 5 minutes as we are coming close to the hour, but just would like to highlight one thing that Adriano had said, namely, and one risks, namely that as the military situation has stabilized, the willingness of governments to not focus on the issues of socioeconomic inequity, not focus on accountability, greater inclusion often disappears, or at least wanes and becomes inadequate. And that's a major pitfall that needs to be avoided. And the dialogue that Adriano spoke about, other mechanisms are very important in making sure this doesn't happen in Mozambique. Dino, there are several questions about the funding of the insurgency, questions specifically to elaborate on the heroin trade in the Cabo Delgado region, and also reflect on the nexus of illegal economies like wildlife trafficking and the insurgency, and for that matter, I would say nexus of illegal economies and government elites. So drugs, poaching, funding, over to you in 5 minutes, please.
Okay, it's not a straightforward picture by any means. In terms of the funding, of course, well, very difficult to get an understanding of how an armed group gets its funding unless you're in that armed group itself. But what we understand from some defectors, some other investigators looking at financial flows and things like that, there are a number of sources. On the ground, we hear that from territory that was under their control, there was a bit of timber smuggling going on connected to the insurgency at a time, but now it's difficult to say what the status of that is when they're on the run. Heroin smuggling was a completely different ball game, and you know, is not directly connected to the insurgency. It was really a trade that was more dominated by local elites, business elites, protected elites. There was some, well, in a sense, the trade sort of was looked upon by some of the insurgents as evidence of the hypocrisy of the elites and things like this, and you know, it played its role in aggravating tensions. You know, why do some of these guys get to be well-paid criminals and we have to hand over half our money from our daily catch of fish to the local you know, checkpoint? Sort of, you know, it played a role in the aggravation of the insurgency in a way. There was some suspicion at the time when the insurgents took parts of the coastline that they were trying to get their teeth into that trade, but if there was any type of connection there, it looks to have been short-lived. I haven't looked into this to the extent that I can be 100% sure about that. It is worth noting, though, that in the past, the UN and other bodies have done investigations 10 years ago where Tanzanian and other Swahili coast drugs networks and the fishermen that plied the waters between Tanzania and Mozambique were involved. Also, you know, on the one hand, involved in being the vessel, the skiffs and the speedboats that offloaded the heroin cargoes from wooden dhows coming from as far away as Iran and Pakistan, but offloading that cargo, you know, those fishermen smugglers who were involved in that were also involved in the smuggling of human fighters, or fighters rather, from Tanzania to Somalia. And there are very detailed previous investigations on that. And some of those networks sort of connected to Mozambique at that time in 2012. it's a very mixed up sort of criminal scene on the ground there, and I guess links back to my very early point that I made in terms of the nature of Cabo Delgado's political economy is one that is sort of wild west, monopoly capture, business barons who control, in very rough terms, the mineral base of the political economy, and then a criminalized space where where elites are also a big part of managing, and then what's left behind are pieces of the crumbs that aren't sufficient, and that have led to feelings of marginalization. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you. Zenaida, one question to you, and then I will ask the same questions to all three of you as the last concluding question, and ask you just to respond, please, in 1 minute. But first, Zenaida, a question solely to you. One of our audience members is asking about the role of the private sector in supporting the IDPs. In terms of corporate social responsibility, has there been any recognition, any efforts to ease the condition of the IDPs, and also about international donor agency? What is the support? You spoke about the vastly inadequate support from the Mozambican government. Is there anyone else, private sector, international actors stepping up to the issue?
Once again, thank you so much, Wanda. Let me first address just one point that Adriano raised and it ticked my mind. The issue of the need to canalize efforts and support to ADIN, which is the Agency for Development of Northern Mozambique, a newly created organization. I just wanted to make sure that we don't turn ADIN into some sort of super government of Mozambique. ADIN was created to address the economic and social roots of the conflict. So it was created to develop Cabo Delgado, not to sort out the problems that have been created by the conflict. And I think one of the ways to move forward is to somehow the Mozambican government, together with international partners and funders of both the government and the ADIN, is to maybe reorganize the terms of references of ADIN and ensure that it is very clear what is the role of ADIN and what is the role of the local government in Cabo Delgado. Because what we are seeing recently is that ADIN is diverting funds, human resources to rebuild what was destroyed over the 4 years. And then it will take another maybe 5-10 years to them address the root cause that actually might have led to this conflict. So what it means then is that we will be delaying on the task of addressing the reasons why conflicts like this continue to emerge in Mozambique and parts of the continent. I think this my answer addressed the point on what donors can do to help. What private sector can do to help, I do appreciate the fact that the Mozambican crisis is competing to many other crises across the globe. There is Ethiopia, there is Syria, there is Iraq, and many other cases across the globe that are facing similar humanitarian crisis. But I think the opportunity private sector has in Mozambique is that this one is starting. So there's still time to stop, or at least to prepare the local communities to address it, to have less of a negative impact on their lives. And they can do that, for example, in the areas like Palmo, Mosimbo, the Praia, I've seen the big investment. It's a repetition of what has been said before, but it's never too much to repeat it again here, to ensure that the dividend, the gains of that investment indeed goes to the local communities, to make sure that there is development in the areas. some of those places that we are talking about here, these names we are mentioned, Mosimbwa, Montepuez, where there are so many rubies, there is very little infrastructure for the local communities. I think that's something that the private sector can look at, reorganize their own terms of references and their social responsibility, and look at Mozambique not just as a normal destination for investment, but a country that has got serious deep-rooted problems that need to be addressed. Because if they are not addressed, and on those serious deep-rooted issues, we should include political exclusion, civil exclusion, poverty, high levels of poverty. If those things are not addressed when those multinationals arrive in those communities, then chances are that they will keep fighting against the community itself, and that's not profit. It's not good for them. It will end up ending in the crisis that we have seen happening across the northern side of Cabo Delgado.
Thank you. Very important urging again that we are hearing repeatedly, and that I hope is registering with everyone joining this conversation. I have one last question, the same question for all of you, and I apologize that I can only give you 1 minute of response on an issue that's not complex. What are Rwanda's interests? Is Rwanda participating in this military intervention out of altruism? What are its key motivations? And what are the risks or not that Rwandan forces might end up being both stuck in and addicted to being in the conflict like they were in the DRC? Maybe let me start with Dino, go to Adriano, and then end with Zenaida. And again, please, 1 minute.
Well, it's very difficult to say with any certainty, but of course, Rwanda has its experience elsewhere on the continent as a sort of policeman in the Central African Republic, for example. And so it's projecting its international or its military credentials across the continent. Of course, a lot of questions have been asked about how Rwanda will sustain financially this intervention if it's not receiving support from elsewhere. And of course, the authorities in Kigali have been very clear that they are the ones who are picking up the tab for this. So there must be some sort of future gain down the road. And of course, it would be in any state's interest that is intervening in a place like Cabo Delgado, which is one of the most resource-rich parts of the continent, to perhaps have some sort of commercial agenda down the road. But I think that is, that is something that is, well, to put it mildly, common in the way that military interventions all over the world have worked in the past.
Excellent. Adriano, 1 minute, please, your take. Adriano, is your mic muted? Well, perhaps I can go to you, Zenaida, for 1 minute of your take on Rwanda's interest, and then come back to Adriano.
I think the quickest question from my side is, I don't know what the Rwanda interest is. I know is that they're already in Mozambique. And as such, I can tell you what I would like them to do while they are here. Number one is to make sure that their operations are transparent, that they allow media to independently go to Cabo Delgado and independently monitor their activities. The second one is to respect human rights and the rule of law. And the third one, and last for me, would be to make sure that they too do not become a source of actions of impunity and abuses against the civilians and which are part of the rest of the Mozambican population.
Excellent. Adriano, is your mic working now? Your last 1 minute on Rwanda.
Yes, Rwanda, as I've indicated, unlike SADC, which came here with a clear mandate emanating from the SADC Assembly, in the case of Rwanda, it resulted of a bilateral agreement with President Nyusi. That is a fragile agreement, and we have seen it in other parts of Africa leading into problems. So if President Kagame would to listen this is to stick by the international humanitarian law. We want to know the terms of reference of their deployment as to what is the exit strategy, how much will the mission cost, and when they will be back and go back home, because these are part of issues that have in other parts of Africa creating problems.
Excellent, indeed. The exit strategy has been an enormous challenge for many international interveners, sometimes with extraordinarily tragic outcomes, as we have been seeing this summer in Afghanistan, and not good prospects in a place like Somalia. I very much hope that this will be avoided in Mozambique, and the conversation today with our extraordinary speakers provided many important lessons, suggestions, recommendations for how to make sure that Mozambique does not become a forever war, that more equity, inclusion, accountability does come to the country, and that in fact the exit out of the conflict and toward peace does take place. I would like to thank very much Professor Nwungu, Mr. Matani, and Ms. Machado for joining us today, sharing their extraordinary insights. I would like to thank all of our audience for the questions and participation. Our webinar will be posted on YouTube in a few hours, and it will be continue to be accessible. And I hope you will all join us on November 22nd, when the Brookings Initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors and the Africa Security Initiative will be exploring the issue of wildlife conservation, biodiversity conservation in Africa after COVID, and the nexus with organized crime and conflict. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.